They didn't wake up wanting to bomb their own country. They woke up realizing it already was. And once you see that, doing nothing stops feeling neutral. The version of the Weather Underground most people carry around is small and convenient. A handful of radicalized kids, too much ideology, too little maturity, a cautionary footnote from a chaotic decade. That version exists for a reason. Because it lets the rest of the story disappear. It lets us believe extremism is an individual flaw, not a predictable response to sustained visible injustice. It lets us believe the system was totally just and fine, and then a few people lost their minds. But movements like the Weather Underground don't emerge from nowhere. They emerge when people watch every acceptable method of dissent fail in real time, and are told calmly and repeatedly that this failure is normal. This isn't a defense of what they did. It's an attempt to understand why people cross lines they once believed were sacred. And why at a certain point, restraint can start to feel immoral. Because that's the uncomfortable part. Not just that they went too far, but that they didn't believe there was anything else they could do. Last episode was about yippies and laughing at power. This one is about what happens when laughter stops working. But before we dig deeper, please like, subscribe, and don't be a poser. By the late 1960s, America wasn't confused about Vietnam. It was committed. The language was clean, the justifications were rehearsed, the casualties were abstract. Vietnam wasn't presented as violence, it was presented as policy. And policy has a way of draining blood from the conversation. You could watch villages burning on television while eating dinner. You could read body counts like baseball scores. You could hear phrases like collateral damage and pacification and strategic Hamlet spoken without irony. What young people were reacting to wasn't just the war. It was the casualness of it. The sense that the entire death machine had been normalized, managed by people who went home at night and slept just fine. At the same time, the civil rights movement was being crushed in slow motion. Not defeated, just suppressed. Leaders assassinated, organizations infiltrated, committees flooded with police, peaceful demonstrations met with batons, dogs, and jail. The message was consistent across movements. You're allowed to protest, but don't disrupt. You're allowed to speak, but don't interfere. Change was permitted only if it remained symbolic. And symbolism does not stop wars. The Weather Underground grew out of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, which was not radical by today's standards or even by the standards of that time. SDS believed in participatory democracy, in mass movements, in moral pressure. They organized teach-ins, campus protests, voter engagement. They believed exposure would force accountability, and for a while that belief held. But as the decades wore on, something became impossible to ignore. The system could absorb dissent without changing course. Marches came and went, elections came and went. The war expanded anyway. Inside SDS, a tension developed, not over goals, but over time. I mean, how long do you wait before patience becomes surrender? That tension eventually split the organization. One side believed in staying broad, disciplined, and nonviolent, even if it was slow. The other side believed slow had become lethal. They argued that every additional year of restraint meant more villages destroyed, more bodies piled up, more lies laundered through respectable language. They didn't see themselves as escalating violence. They believed they were responding to it honestly. That belief would carry them much further than they originally intended. Bring the war home is usually quoted like a threat, but it was meant as a diagnosis. The war was already home, just unevenly distributed. It lived in Southeast Asia, in black neighborhoods, in prisons, in police departments, and FBI files. The Weather Underground believed that as long as most Americans could live untouched by the consequences of empire, nothing would change. So their goal wasn't random destruction. It was confrontation. Not mass casualties, but visibility. To shatter the illusion that violence could be outsourced indefinitely. You can reject that logic, but you can't understand them without it. There's an easy dismissal here that gets deployed. That these kids were privileged kids playing revolutionary. And yeah, many of them were white. Many came from middle-class backgrounds. Many had access to education. But that doesn't automatically produce detachment. Sometimes it produces clarity. They were close enough to power to see how it worked, how language hid brutality, how legality protected violence, how educated men justified mass death without raising their voices. They didn't grow up outside the system. They grew up inside and watched it function exactly as designed. That realization tends to destabilize people in different ways. Some retreat, some rationalize, some decide neutrality is no longer an option. The turning point, the moment where myth and reality collide, is the Days of Rage in Chicago, 1969. It was supposed to be the eruption, thousands flooding the streets, a militant refusal to cooperate, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Instead, it was chaotic and small. Poor turnout, overwhelming police presence, people injured, nothing achieved. The failure mattered because it exposed a truth no one wanted to face. The mass movement wasn't coming, not in the way they had imagined. The public wasn't radicalizing fast enough. The war machine wasn't slowing down. Visibility no longer felt like power. And that realization didn't produce caution. It produced desperation. Going underground wasn't glamorous. It was suffocating. Fake identities, constant fear of informants, rotating safe houses, no audience, no applause. Once you disappear, the world doesn't watch you anymore. There are no rallies underground, no chants, no solidarity, selfies, just commitment and isolation. And isolation has a way of hardening certainty. The moment that permanently reshaped the Weather Underground came not from the state, but from themselves. In 1970, a townhouse in New York City exploded. 3 members died. They were building a bomb intended for a dance attended by U.S. soldiers and their partners. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't abstract. This was the line everyone remembers. And it's the moment that changed everything. Not because it shocked the public, but because it shocked the group. The explosion forced a reckoning they couldn't avoid. If they continued down this path, people would die. Not hypothetically, not eventually, but directly. From that point on, the Weather Underground made a decision that complicates the narrative. They stopped targeting people. They focused on property, on symbols of state power, on buildings, not bodies. They issued warnings. They tried to avoid casualties. It doesn't absolve them, but it does reveal something important. Even underground, even radicalized, even cornered, they were still wrestling with limits. This is where the story usually ends in popular retellings. Bombs, hiding, and eventually fading out. But the reality, it's much slower and stranger. Living underground kind of erodes your identity. You don't grow, you don't evolve, you just maintain. And maintenance becomes its own ideology. Paranoia replaces strategy, commitment replaces reflection. The world keeps moving, and you're frozen inside a decision you made years ago. That's not victory, it's endurance. And while the Weather Underground disappeared from public life, the state didn't relax. COINTELPRO expanded, surveillance deepened, police militarized. Many of the tactics justified by radical movements were already being used quietly against much broader populations. The difference was visibility. When radicals did it, it was called terror. When the state did it, it was called security. That asymmetry never went away. Eventually, the group dissolved, not with a bang, but with exhaustion. Members resurfaced, turned themselves in, faced reduced sentences. The revolution never came. The war eventually ended, not because of bombs at home, but because it became too expensive politically and economically to continue. And that fact haunts the story, because it raises a question no one likes asking. Did any of it matter? The easy answer is no. The honest answer is complicated. They didn't end the war. They didn't spark mass uprising. They didn't dismantle the system. But they exposed something that never quite went back into hiding. That the line between violence and order is thinner than we pretend. That legality and morality aren't the same thing. That patience can be weaponized by power. The Weather Underground wasn't a success story. It was a warning flare about what happens when people conclude, rightly or wrongly, that the system will never stop itself. And that's why their story still unsettles people. Not just because of what they did, but because of what pushed them there. Because the most uncomfortable part of the Weather Underground story isn't the bombs. It's what happened after the noise stopped. Once the group went fully underground, the mythology collapses fast. No rallies, no speeches, no visible momentum. Just people living in borrowed rooms, using fake names, constantly listening for footsteps that weren't there yet. Revolutionary romance doesn't survive long in that environment. What survives is routine, and routine has a way of turning extreme choices into normal ones. Life underground wasn't a heroic montage. It was monotony wrapped in fear. You wake up, you check the street, you don't answer the phone, don't write things down, don't talk to strangers, and you don't trust easily. Sometimes not even each other. Every decision is filtered through risk. Who can we contact? Where can we sleep? What's traceable? Who might already be compromised? When you live like that long enough, your world shrinks, not just physically, morally. You stop asking big questions because survival eats all the oxygen. And that's where something important happens. The original political clarity that drove the Weather Underground starts to erode. Not because they abandon it, but because it hardens. Beliefs become armor instead of inquiry. Certainty replaces reflection. That's not unique to radicals. It's what isolation does to anyone. The Weather Underground didn't radicalize further underground, they fossilized. The ideas that stayed frozen in the late 60s while the world kept moving. The war dragged on, but public opinion slowly shifted. The anti-war movement fractured, then dissipated. Other movements rose, changed, adapted. But underground, time doesn't move forward the same way. You're always reacting, never recalibrating. And that creates a quiet contradiction. They believed in mass liberation, but they were increasingly cut off from actual people. They believed in solidarity, but lived in secrecy. They believed in collective struggle, but their world had narrowed to a handful of trusted faces. That tension never resolved. One of the least talked about aspects of the Weather Underground is how deliberately they avoided killing after the townhouse explosion. This is often dismissed as damage control or public relations, but internally it was something else. It was an admission. They had crossed a line they couldn't justify, even to themselves. So they adapted. They targeted buildings associated with state power, police stations, courthouses, Pentagon-related offices. They issued warnings. They timed explosions to avoid casualties. Again, this does not make them righteous, but it reveals a reality that doesn't fit clean narratives. They weren't bloodthirsty. They weren't indifferent to harm. They were trapped between believing violence was necessary and believing killing was wrong. That contradiction never stopped hurting. And here's where the story becomes less dramatic, but more revealing. The Weather Underground didn't collapse because the FBI crushed them. They collapsed because the moment passed. The war ended, the draft ended. The urgency that fueled everything began to dissipate. You can't sustain permanent emergency indefinitely. At some point, adrenaline runs out. People want lives again, families, jobs, an identity beyond resistance. That desire doesn't mean the struggle was fake. It means that people are human. When the members resurfaced, the public response was confused and often furious. Some received surprisingly light sentences. Some avoided prison entirely. Some re-entered academic and professional life. This becomes Exhibit A for critics. Proof, they said, that this was all a game. That privilege insulated them from consequences. And yeah, privilege mattered. But that critique skips over something uncomfortable. The state didn't suddenly forgive them. It simply recalculated. By the late 70s, prosecuting them aggressively risked reopening wounds the country wanted closed. Vietnam was over. The political appetite for reckoning was gone. Punishment wouldn't restore legitimacy. Silence was cheaper. This is where the Weather Underground story stops being about them and starts being about us. Because the real legacy isn't whether they were right or wrong. It's what their existence reveals about how power responds to dissent. Peaceful protest is tolerated until it threatens outcomes. Disruption is criminalized once it becomes effective. Violence is condemned selectively, depending on who controls it. That pattern didn't end in the 1970s. It was just refined. Modern protest movements still run into the same wall. Marches that are allowed, speech that's permitted, outrage that's monetized. But structural disruption, that's where the response sharpens. Surveillance, infiltration, legal pressure, media framing. The Weather Underground didn't invent these dynamics, but they exposed them. And there's a temptation, especially online, to flatten the story into morality plays. On the right, they're irredeemable terrorists. On the left, they're either heroes or embarrassing relics. Both sides sort of miss the point. The Weather Underground is not a model to copy. They're a case to study. And how people radicalize when they believe all legitimate avenues are closed. And how moral certainty corrodes under isolation. And how movements lose touch with the people they claim to represent. And in how the state prefers extremism because it discredits dissent. Here's the part that's hardest to sit with. The Weather Underground didn't emerge because America failed to live up to its ideals. They emerged because America did exactly what it said it would do, once you stop believing in the marketing. They protect interests, project power, and manage dissent. That realization breaks people in different ways. Some accommodate, some numb out, and some radicalize. None of those responses are abstract. They're totally human. And that's why the story still matters. Not because we're on the brink of revolution, but because the conditions that produce despair haven't gone away. Wars still happen far from home. Violence is still bureaucracy. Protest is still permitted, as long as it doesn't interfere. And people are still told that patience is maturity, until patience becomes unbearable. And the Weather Underground didn't win. They didn't save the country. They didn't destroy it either. They burned themselves out trying to force recognition. What they leave behind isn't a roadmap. It's a question. What happens when people stop believing the system will correct itself? And what do we do so the question doesn't get answered the same way again? Because if there's anything more unsettling than what the Weather Underground did, it's how understandable their starting point still feels. Thanks again. This has been Slack Signal X.